Okay, here we are. I'm going to try to present this lecture in a video format. We'll see how it goes. Take notes. At the end of our last class, we were examining the meeting in Bloodwedding of the bride and her former lover, Leonardo, on the morning of her marriage in Act 2. Now, we know that Leonardo shouldn't be there on the morning of her wedding to another man. And the first thing he does is mock the orange blossoms that the groom has purchased for the bride, for her to carry as a traditional symbol of virginity. He doesn't know that the bride earlier, in frustration, threw those orange blossoms away in a fit of disgust and fury. But Leonardo reminds the bride, his former lover, that he could never have afforded such an expensive gift. Indeed, he couldn't afford to marry her when they, 3 years before, were together. But he also reminds the bride that while she may be a virgin, at least technically, the two of them had a passionate love affair. That seems built into the reference to the orange blossoms and whether she should carry them or not. Now, the scene reveals how the fire of passion is still burning in both of them. The bride admits that when Leonardo rides by her window every night, she is powerfully tempted to ride off with him, to ride away from her lonely life in a cave in the wasteland, even though he is married to the bride's cousin. She says, "A man with a horse knows many things and can do a lot to take advantage of a girl abandoned in a desert. But I've got my pride, which is why I'm getting married, and I'll shut myself away with my husband, and I'll love him above everything." Now, just as Leonardo married the bride's cousin in an attempt to rein in his desire for the bride, so too the bride now tells Leonardo that although she is still powerfully moved by him, she is marrying another man, quote, to shut herself away from him. Now, of course, we know that the prospect of such a dull domestic life frightens and appalls the bride. It is, after all, this life she is envisioning too much like the one she is enduring and has endured with her father in the wasteland. Her future mother-in-law tells the bride that marriage means, quote, living behind a wall 2 feet thick. Yet just before the ceremony, the bride tells the bridegroom that that isolation, that protection from him, is what, in fact, she says protection from Leonardo is what, in fact, she says she wants. They have this conversation. The bridegroom says, "With a crown, it's a joy to look at you." The bride replies, "Let's get to the church quickly." Bridegroom, "Why the hurry?" Bride, "I want to be your wife and to be alone with you and not hear any voice but yours." Bridegroom, "That's just what I want." To which the bride then says, "And see only your eyes, and to have you hold me tight, so tight that even if my mother were to call me my dead mother, I couldn't free myself from you." Now, the groom, of course, thinks that she means that she loves only him and that she wants to devote her life to him alone. But we realize that what the bride really wants and is referring to here is protection in marriage against her transgressive, adulterous desire for Leonardo. She is afraid of herself, or more precisely, she's afraid of her inability to control her own sexual desire for Leonardo. Now, consider Leonardo's response to the bride when she says that she is marrying so that she can wall herself off from him. Leonardo responds to this by noting, "To keep quiet, the burn is the greatest punishment we can heap upon ourselves. What use was pride to me, and not seeing you and leaving you awake night after night on my horse? It only brought the fire down on top of me. When the roots of things go deep, no one can pull them up." To which the bride replies, "I can't hear you. I can't hear your voice. It's as if I drunk a bottle of anise and fallen asleep on a bedspread of roses, and it drags me along, and I know that I'm drowning, but I still go on." Now, note that the words of Leonardo reveal that what Racine depicts in Phaedra is true here. What he's essentially suggesting is that the more barriers one tries to impose to desire, like the barrier of his own marriage, the more desire burns and the more it becomes overpowering. the attempt to extinguish the flame only intensifies it. In fact, the bride says that she is so aroused just by the sound of Leonardo's voice that she acknowledges her own sexual desire for him is overpowering. She describes how she feels comparing her desire for him and her passion first to a rose, and then to drunkenness, and then to the wave in a sea. You'll note that within this language of erotic desire, passion is both evoked as a raging fire at times and also as a kind of flood or tidal wave. And these oppositional elements, fire and water, come together in desire, which overrides all boundaries and all restrictions and all seeming opposites. Clearly, passion in this play overrides individual will and self-control. It overrides social conventions and marriage customs, and it overrides religious law as well. Now, the church, you'll remember, which will join the bride and groom in marriage, regards wedlock as a sacrament and blesses it as a state of monogamy in which sex functions as a means to reproduction. Even though the mother longs for the compassionate sexual love that she enjoyed with her dead husband, she, like the church, also emphasizes the idea of marriage as a means to children. She tells the bride's father, "My son will cover her well. He's of good seed. His father could have had many more sons with me." The ungovernable desire that the bride and Leonardo feel for each other has nothing to do, of course, with a desire for reproduction, and it violates all cultural and religious and familial traditions. Now, it's notable that when the bride appears, arrayed now for the ceremony after her conversation with Leonardo, she is not dressed in white, but rather in black. And more particularly, she is dressed not in the style of the 1930s, when the play is set, but rather in the style of a wedding dress of 1900, when her mother was married unhappily. It is as if the bride is already aware in choosing this dress that she is following in the footsteps of her unhappy mother, who in marriage, we're told, quote, wasted away, but who also, according to rumor, tried to break away from this life of sterility and domesticity in a scandalous affair. Now, Leonardo's wife similarly sees herself as destined to follow a particular family history. We learned that Leonardo's father abandoned her abandoned his wife, and that the woman, the wife in question, feels that Leonardo will certainly do the same to her. We're told that Leonardo says, the wife says, "One thing I do know, I've already been thrown aside, but I've got a child and another one is coming. It's the way things are. My mother's fate was the same." The bride's, wife's father was unfaithful, and she feels therefore that she too, like her mother, is destined to suffer infidelity, that history is simply going to be repeating itself. I made a mistake, not Leonardo's father who was unfaithful, it was her own father who was unfaithful. Now, remember that the wife's mother, who has also been abandoned by a man, as the wife will be abandoned by Leonardo, that her mother foresaw in that curious chant they were singing the same thing happening to her daughter as has happened to her. In that chant, you remember, she envisions Leonardo as a restless, tormented horse seeking a mare, specifically, the bride in a far-off valley. It's not just a prophecy, it's a vision of what she sees as inevitable. Now, we realize in such passages that what Aristotle in the Poetics calls the force of tragic necessity, in Blood Wedding, that necessity isn't just the monumental power of erotic desire as we see it in The Bride and Leonardo. Also, it is the force of family inheritance, the way in which the same patterns and events are repeated through generations of the same bloodline. The agonizing but futile struggle against the two forces of necessity, carnal desire and family history, is then the essence of Lorca's conception of tragedy, a struggle against what one ultimately can never resist or overcome. Now, note that this twofold idea of necessity rooted in carnal desire and family history harkens back to Racine, but even beyond Racine, to Greek tragedy itself. We find the compulsion of heredity, in particular in Greek tragedy, say in the character of Orestes, who inherits an interfamily feud, and like Leonardo and like the bridegroom, is driven to perpetuate violence even to his own destruction. Now, the blood feud between the groom's family and the Felixes, of which Leonardo is a member, that blood feud is the clearest manifestation of the irresistible force of heredity in the play, one in which each generation is doomed to inherit and repeat the sins of its parents. We are told, for example, by the mother, that the blood of the entire family, it comes from his great-grandfather, the Felixes, who started the killing, and it spread through the whole Felix breed, all of them, knife-handled, smiling hypocrites. She said, yes, men, all men are like the wind. In the nature of things, they have to handle weapons. Now, note that this vision of the future through the force of heredity is one that the groom naively imagines he can escape. He tells his mother early on in the play, you remember, that the feud that killed his father and his brother with the Felixes is nothing to worry about, that he'll somehow escape it. But of course, she knows better. From the beginning, his mother is filled with dread and also with, as we've seen, a sense of violent rage against the Felixes. The suggestion that they are all knife handlers, that they are all unreliable, that they are all in some way destined to perpetuate the violence of their forebears. Now, what the mother calls here the nature of things, then, is essentially the force both of her family history, which she's come to see as part of human history. Men are by nature knife handlers. They are doomed somehow to destroy one another, and in her family in particular. In short, the mother is a fatalist. Now, according to a comparable law of heredity, both the bride and Leonardo, you remember, come from bloodlines marked by restlessness and transgressive passion that neither the groom nor Leonardo's wife are able to understand or ultimately resist. When Leonardo tells his wife that he's going to ride to the church for the wedding on his horse rather than go with her, he says, I'm not the kind of man to go by cart. He can't adapt himself to the conventions of society or to the restraints of domestic life, or certainly to the norms of marriage. He resents his wife as an impediment to his sexual freedom that he craves, even though he also clearly feels guilty for his inability to control that craving. Yet, ironically, we realize that Leonardo's passion is itself a compulsion, not a sign of freedom. He would like to be free to enact his passion for the bride, and imagines that as a kind of freedom, but in fact that is the manifestation of what he finds that he cannot control. It's the expression of necessity within him. There is, in short, no free will in this play. Now, it's notable that we don't witness the wedding itself on stage. Rather, we see the reception, one in which Lorca juxtaposes the force of ritualized religious and cultural traditions against the forces of passion, sexual passion, and heredity that I have described. The dance that we see on stage, and which the characters also refer to, is done to traditional Spanish guitar music. It's an expression of cultural tradition. That is to say, it's ritualized, it's ordered, controlled, and communal. As such, that dance is the antithesis of the passion burning in the newly married bride and Leonardo. That passion, that uncontrollable impulse, is anarchic, explosive, and far from being communal, it is confined to the two of them. Now, we see that the bride is already chafing under everything that marriage customs represent, even at the reception. And indeed, the groom's mother sees this too when she approaches her. The mother says, your blessings weigh heavily upon you. The bride says, like lead. The mother then says strongly, but they shouldn't. You should be as light as a dove. It is, after all, your marriage day. Now, note that the groom senses something is wrong as well. The bride, after all, won't join him in the communal dance, which is, after all, part of the cultural tradition of the region. The bridegroom looks at her and embraces her a bit roughly. "Stop it," she says. Bride, "Well, why?" he says, releasing her. "Well," she says, "the guests, they can see us." A servant comes, backs cross stage, without looking at the bride and the bridegroom, to which the bridegroom then says, "So, we've taken our vows?" To which the bride answers, "Yes, but leave me be for now." The bridegroom then says, "What's the matter? It's as if you're frightened." "No, it's nothing." And then she says, "Don't go." A moment later, the servant comes in again and asks, "What's the matter, child?" To which the bride says, if someone struck me on the head." And then the bridegroom says, "Oh, come, let's go and dance a bit," and kisses her. The bride, disturbed, "No, I want to lie down on the bed." "Oh, I'll come with you." No, not with these people here. What would they say?" "Just let me rest a moment," she tells the groom. To which he says, "Whatever you want, but don't be like this tonight." To which the bride, in an important moment, says, "I'll be better tonight." To which he says, "I hope you will." Now let us analyze this for a moment. At first, the bride asks her new husband, who she doesn't want to touch her and whom she doesn't want to dance with, she says, nonetheless, "No, don't go," because she is clearly at that moment, in her deep dissatisfaction, afraid of what she might do, of where her lawless passion for Leonardo might take her. She feels so overwhelmed by her desire that she feels, as she tells the servant, that someone has struck me on the head. But then, a moment later, she tells the groom she wants to be alone, ostensibly to rest, to lie down. But really, we realize, I think at this moment, really to be alone so that she can run off with Leonardo. Her remark, "I'll be better tonight," is coded. The groom thinks she means she'll be ready to enjoy their wedding night. But in this moment of double discourse, what she's really doing is speaking to herself as well. And she means, "I'll be better tonight because I'll be with Leonardo." Now, this would be a moment, one might say, if we were to apply Aristotle's model, this would be a moment of Aristotelian hamartia. It's a mistake. It's an error in judgment on the bride's part that will lead to a tragic calamity. But as in Greek tragedy, we realize that the bride isn't really free here in committing this fatal mistake. The power of her desire, the power of her family history is dictating her flight from marriage and to Leonardo, no matter how she may struggle against it. And when we see the bride next, because this is the last we see of her in Act 2 when she leaves, when we see her next in Act 3, she and Leonardo are on the run in the moonlight. Now, how do we know that she intends to run away with Leonardo at this exact moment, as I have suggested? Well, consider an important but subtle exchange that occurs just a few moments earlier at the reception. Here, the bridegroom says, "Did you like the orange blossom?" To which the bride, looking fixedly, lies and says, "Yes." The bridegroom says, "It's all made of wax. It'll last forever. I'd like you to have worn them all over your dress." There's no need for that. Leonardo then goes off to the right. A girl comes in. "We'll take the pins out." The bride then says to the bridegroom, "I'll be back in a minute. I hope you'll be happy." Okay? A moment later, the bridegroom says, "It's a special day," to which Leonardo's wife says, "Where's Leonardo?" "I haven't seen him. He must be with the guests." "Oh, I'll go and see him." "Ah, it's beautiful. Aren't you dancing?" "No." Now, note that in this short exchange, what we find is the important fact of what is occurring off stage. Leonardo and the bride go off separately, moments apart. He sees her leave, she excuses herself, and then he disappears, okay? Or one might assume that perhaps he's left a little earlier and then she is the one who follows him. It's unclear, but one certainly sees the absence of the other and then follows. Now, their brief absence together then seems to be the time in which they plan their getaway later in Act 2. Note, though, at the end of the passage I read, the wife is already suspicious. Where's Leonardo, she asks, particularly after she sees that the bride has also gone. Meanwhile, the groom is smothering in his attention. When the bride comes back briefly after the assignation with Leonardo, which it appears they plan their getaway later, when she comes back, he says he would like to cover her with orange blossoms as a mark of his constant desire to possess her as his property. He says this both before she leaves and reinforces it later after she comes back with his unwelcome embraces. Now, even though Leonardo seems to have asked the bride to run away with him during their brief offstage meeting, nonetheless, when the bride returns, as we've seen, she is still conflicted. She feels as if someone has struck her on the head. She's terrified both of a restrictive, isolated life in marriage with a man that she doesn't love, but she's also terrified of the lawless passion for Leonardo that has led her to meet him outside. Now, this terror comes out when the groom then embraces her unexpectedly, and her response indicates that she instinctively thinks that this figure who comes up behind her and gives her this hug is not her husband, but the man she has just been with, Leonardo. The bridegroom enters slowly and embraces the bride from behind. "Don't," startled the bridegroom. "Are you frightened of me?" Oh, she says, "it's you." "Who else? Me or your father?" Yes, though your father would have hugged you more gently." The bride says, "Yes, because he's very old, right? He embraces her more strongly now, a bit roughly." "Stop it." Okay, now note here that at this moment, the bride is afraid of any male embrace. She's afraid of the binding embrace of her father, certainly, but also afraid of the binding embrace of her new husband. But perhaps most of all at this moment, when this embrace comes from behind, having just seen Leonardo, she's afraid of Leonardo's embrace precisely because she longs for it so much and is afraid that she will succumb to it, as indeed she does. The barrier of the marriage, with all of the social and religious emphasis on monogamy, has only intensified the flame of her desire for Leonardo. It was intense before, during the engagement. The fact now of being married, what ought to be a barricade, has only made it deeper and more intense, and with it increased her dread and fear of her own desire. In Act 2, when it ends, we find that now the mother, who has so much from the beginning dreaded the renewal of the blood feud, urges her son now to renew that blood feud, to take his place in it by seeking vengeance against Leonardo, both the man who stole his wife and also a member of the hated Felix clan. Now her fear for her son's life is overshadowed by her need for blood vengeance. She says, when the father says, "It's not true, my daughter could not have run off," she says, "Yes, your daughter, a plant from a wicked mother, and him too, him too, him too." Again, the sense of family heredity, both Leonardo's family and the bride's, somehow not to be trusted, somehow given inherently to adulterous transgressions. Now, turning to her son, the mother says, "Those people kill quickly and well, but go on and I'll follow. Let's go and help my son. He's got plenty of family, his cousins from the coast and those from inland. Go out from here. Search all the road. The hour of blood has come again. Two sides. You on yours, me on mine. After them. Get after them." Now, you'll note the mother's ringing words. The hour of blood has come again. It's a phrase that unites the folk tragedy of a local war between two families in southern Spain. It unites that with the universalizing conventions of Greek tragedy, in which events are destined to repeat themselves as well. But I would suggest that the phrase, "the hour of blood has come again," also points to the mythological or even anthropological framework of the play by suggesting that really all human history is, in a certain sense, inevitable repetition. The same basic stories, the same elemental patterns come round and round again and again and again. Now, before turning to Act 3, I hope that you will all see now, if you have not had a look at it heretofore, the scene from the Spanish director Carlos Suero's flamenco version of Blood Wedding. It's fantastic. It was done in the early 1980s. And Suero, a Spaniard himself, from Andalusia, tells the story of the play silently, entirely in dance movements. And the scene in question that I have sent you a link to is the one that depicts the events at the reception that I have just been analyzing. You'll see first the bride dancing with Leonardo's suspicious-looking wife, and then you see the bride dancing dutifully and rather unhappily with the groom, but only briefly. Then we see, even as they dance, that she is distracted. And after dancing for a bit, she pushes him away gently and then runs off stage. She is, of course, at that moment, fleeing to run off with Leonardo, as she does when she disappears after she tells the husband that I'm going to lie down. I'll be better tonight. Meanwhile, the groom in this clip dances then with his mother, while Leonardo's wife rushes out suspiciously to follow the bride off stage. Then she comes back. She knows what has happened, and her dance gestures when the wife returns indicate that she is announcing to the crowd that the bride and Leonardo have absconded together. If you haven't viewed it yet, as I suggested, do so. And you can do it now, because now I'm going to turn to Act 3, and we will proceed from there. Okay. Still with me, I hope, here? When we turn to Act 3, suddenly, what has been a play that has been a sort of hybrid blend of folk realism and symbolism, suddenly it becomes a full-blown symbolist fantasia, okay? The woodcutters who converse at the start are clearly modeled on an ancient Greek chorus. And like a chorus in Sophocles or Euripides' tragedies, these woodcutters do two things. First, they comment on the action. Specifically, they describe the lovers' escape from the wedding reception into the forest. And second, they express sympathy for them, the way choruses express sympathy characteristically for Electra or Oedipus or Medea. Now, the woodcutters are afraid that the moon, because it is a full moon, will illuminate the lovers in their flight and expose them to the posse, who, as we saw at the end of Act 2, is in hot pursuit. The woodcutters know that the lovers were driven by a passion in their blood. They understand this. And they understand that these two, Leonardo and the bride, had to surrender to that desire, that that desire overrides everything else, even if, as they suspect it will lead to death. It was somehow necessary, somehow inevitable. We're given this remark as they converge. The woodcutters say, when the moon rises, they'll see them. They should leave them alone. The world's big. Everyone can live in it. You have to follow your instinct. They were right to run away. They were deceiving each other in the end. The blood was the strongest. Ah, yes, the blood. You have to follow the blood's path. But the blood that sees the light, the earth drinks it. What of it? Better to be a bloodless corpse, alive, than let your blood putrefy. Better, in short, to follow your passion, even if it leads to death, than to repress it and let the blood passion in you putrefy or become corrupted. Now, note that these woodcutters express sympathy then for the lovers that violates social and religious precepts. And they do so because these men live outside society, outside religion. They live in nature, among the trees. And they see the lover's passion, therefore, as entirely natural itself. Appropriately, you might say, the woodcutters are associated with sexual release because they live in a kind of phallic splendor. They live among, quote, great moist tree trunks. And yet they have no women themselves. Now, it may seem curious to you that they embody a kind of erotic principle living in the forest among these trees, even though they cut the trees down. Nonetheless, clearly they're on the side of passion. And note that living in nature and celebrating erotic passion, they themselves, of course, live without women. There's a kind of sense of envy here, a kind of longing. Indeed, what we find them describing is a sort of vicarious erotic fantasy. The woodcutters imagine that Leonardo and the bride are at the very moment that they're speaking, consummating their love in the forest, and that this long-delayed, pent-up sexual union that they're enjoying has been worth it, even though they sense it may lead to death. The first woodcutter says, now he'll be loving her. The second, her body for him, his body for her. The third, they'll find them and they'll kill them. The first, but they'll have mixed their bloods by then. They'll be like two empty pitchers, like two dry streams. Okay. Now, note that unfortunately, they're wrong in this. Leonardo and the bride don't sexually consummate their desire, as we soon learn. They are too busy running away from those who are chasing them, too busy trying to hide, too busy trying to find a place where they can make love. As the bride puts it, just before they are discovered, quote, "Leaves weep for me, a woman lost and still a virgin." Okay, she's lost in the sense that society will view her as a lost woman. They will assume that she and Leonardo have in fact consummated this alliance. But the greater tragedy is that she will, even though she's viewed that way, die a virgin. She'll die that way when, as we see, Leonardo and her husband kill one another. Now, the woodcutter's idea of sex, not just as a stirring of the blood, but as they put it, as an actual union, of flowing together of the blood of a man and the woman, that idea of sex as a blood union is an ancient one. It goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And the same is true of the woodcutter's celebration of sexual love as a kind of death, in that image that their vessels will be emptied. It's an image that suggests that they will have become emptied of their passion, and for the man, emptied of the blood-derived seminal fluid, but also that it's very likely that they will be caught and they will be emptied of their blood. In short, that their sexual passion and their deaths will coincide. Now, part of what Lorca is alluding to through the woodcutter's conversation is a conjunction of love and death that goes like this. Orgasm, as the French called it, is regarded as the petit mort, the little death. But there's a second meaning built into the love-death conjunction here. Also the idea that the forbidden love of Leonardo and the bride can find its ultimate fulfillment, its lasting fulfillment, beyond whatever actual sexual connection may take place, only in death. Because, of course, their sexual love, their sexual alliance wouldn't be allowed to persist in life, in the world, even if they did enjoy it. Death is the only place where they can be together. Now, we expect that that is going to happen. We expect, based on what the woodcutters have said, that Lorca will present this grand love-death in which the lovers come together and then expire. But Lorca subverts that love-in-death expectation, and he does so in a very disturbing way. You remember, after the woodcutters, the moon then enters. The moon as an anthropomorphized character who takes the visible form of a pale woodcutter, a woodcutter with a white face, like the white face of the moon. At first, the moon seems narrowly symbolic as an embodiment of death, okay? Because he casts his pale spectral light over all of the action in Act 3, and it is the light of this moon that will allow those seeking the lovers to find them. His cold beams seem to stalk the runaway lovers, and he opposes this moon, the vitalism of the other woodcutters. He opposes their love and life with a desire to destroy. Unlike the protective woodcutters, the cold moon wants to shed his beams so that the couple can be discovered and so that the posse can destroy them. The moon puts it this way. In the light stage left, the moon appears. The moon is a young woodcutter with a white face. The stage takes on an intense blue light. He speaks, "They shall not escape. the moon places a knife abandoned in the sky that is a leaden ambush and longs to be the pain of blood. No, they shan't get away, for I'll make a horse shine with fever bright as a diamond. They'll be seen, they'll be caught. Okay, now note that as with every other symbol that we've seen Lorca deploy, however, that he introduces and then complicates and oftentimes presents with a kind of double or triple or even contradictory meaning, this is also going to be true of the moon. Because at first, as we've seen, the moon declares that it is cold, that it seems to be punishing sexual passion, and that it seeks the lover's death. The moon, in the passage I read, associates itself with the knife, the two knives that are going to inflict a twofold death. But as the moon continues, it becomes clear that Lorca is compounding its meaning in other ways. It becomes clear that the solitary moon actually, rather than being an opponent of sexual passion and wanting to kill it because he hates it, rather he envies it, okay? In much the same way that the woodcutters envy, but rather than celebrating it vicariously, he wants to do something else in his envy. In his frustrated state, this moon craves the aroused blood of human desire for himself as a kind of vampire. The only way to drain this passionate blood from the lovers that he craves and his paleness is, of course, to shed their aroused blood at the moment of their arousal. Consider what the moon says. The snow bears me on its back of jasper, and water drowns me, cold and hard in pools. And so tonight there'll be red blood to fill my cheeks, and the rushes forming clusters. For I want to enter a breast where I can warm myself. Let me come on, oh, let me come in. Let me come into the lovers in the form of a knife. As they are aroused with passion, let me cut them open and drain their blood that I may warm myself. Okay, now the pale vampiric moon then becomes passionate about absorbing the passionate lifeblood of others. But Lorca complicates the moon's meaning even more a little bit later when Leonardo responds to the moonlight. Rather than associating the moonlight with coldness, with an exposure to death, or with vampirism, he tells the bride that the moonlight is the outward expression of the incandescent nature of their desire for each other. Here's what Leonardo has to say on the subject. Leonardo says, but where you go, I go, and you too. Take a step, see? Nails of moonlight join us, my waist and your hips. The whole scene is strong, full of great sensuality. Sensuality now linked with moonlight. Moonlight as a force that he says binds us, joins us, nails us together. Now, this notion of nails of moonlight, as if the beams were binding them together, suggests, of course, a force of destiny. Desire, sexual desire, does bind them together inseparably. But the image, of course, of nails, moonlight as nails, also points to bloodshed, anticipating the violent bloodshed that comes from the penetration of steel knives into the bodies of Leonardo and the groom. Now, when we first see the bride in Act 3, she is filled at first with guilt and remorse for the sexual need that has driven her to flee her marriage and that she hates in herself. But she seems unable to resist it, and she hates also her inability to resist. She recalls in this first view of her in Act 3, Phaedra, in the way she torments herself, so that desire itself becomes for her a source of simultaneous pleasure, but also of agony as she speaks, as they're running away to Leonardo. She says, there's not a minute of the day that I don't want to be with you, because you drag me and I come, and you tell me, go back, and I follow you through the air like a blade of grass. I've left a good man and all his family in the middle of my wedding and wearing my bridal crown of orange blossoms. She then says, as if I were a bitch, as if I were a bitch, because that's what I am. This recalls, you may remember, Marie in Wojciech. She has no more power over her libido than Marie does. But I look at you, Leonardo, and your beauty burns me. To which he replies, flame is fueled and fired by flame, and the same small flame can kill 2 ears of grain together. Come on, and pulls her. Where are you taking me? To a place where they can't go. These men who are all around us, where I can look at you. Okay. Now, note that Leonardo, unlike the bride, doesn't blame himself, as she does, for being unable to keep his passion in check through his own marriage. He knows that he and the bride are moved by a force of desire that originates not just in themselves, but in nature itself. As he puts it, I'm not the one at fault. The fault belongs to the earth and that scent that comes from and blesses your breasts and your hair. Yes, we are following the force of nature in us. We are not to blame. We're beyond guilt somehow. And he wants to take the bride to a secret place, but he believes that just as they burn with a common desire, so too they will possibly burn together. When he speaks, for example, of the flame, the same flame that kills 2 ears of grains together, that flame that kills the 2 ears is the flame of their passion, but it is also a destructive flame. Like blood, fire is something associated both with passion and with death. And Leonardo, even as he wants to go off to a place where they can make love, knows that just as they are not to blame for the uncontrollable force of their desire, so too he knows that they will die. But he imagines that they will die together, just as the woodcutters did. Okay, but there is, after all, no climactic Wagnerian moment of love-death, as he predicts and the woodcutters envision. No moment even of sexual consummation for Leonardo and the bride. This, despite the vow that the two make to one another just before they are found, a vow that they will be together unto death. Leonardo says, if they separate us, it will be because I am dead. And the bride says, and I will be dead too. They leave embracing each other. A moment later, the moon appears, as we shall see, and we hear shrieks, the shrieks of those who are dying, but not Leonardo and the bride, Leonardo and the groom. Now, you'll note that the vow of love that Leonardo and the bride make until death mimics, echoes, and ultimately eclipses the vows that the bride and the groom made as man and wife, even though it was off stage. That is, of course, the marriage vows. And what we find then is this suggestion, just before they leave the stage, that they have eclipsed somehow in their natural love and passion for one another, and their natural vitality for one another, everything that society and the church sanctions in the vows that man and wife make. But just as they're about to leave stage, we're told, the lovers are replaced by the moon, who has just exposed them. And then this is followed by something else. The moon has revealed them. They're about to be captured. The moon appears slowly just after they embrace and leave. The stage takes on a strong blue light. The two violins are heard. Suddenly, two long piercing screams, and the music of the violins stops. With the second scream, the beggar woman appears and stands with her back to the audience. She opens her cloak and stands center stage like a great bird with huge wings. The moon stops. The curtain comes down in total silence. Now, note that the two screams that we hear, we're likely at first to mistakenly take to be those of the two lovers in death. But then this other figure appears, not the moon, but the beggar woman, we're told, with a cloak that she extends outward to resemble the wings of a great dark bird, the shadow of death. She is even more an embodiment of death than the moon, but unlike the moon, there are no other dimensions to her. She is simply death. Now, note that we don't see the actual killing, the stabbing. This is another nod on Lorca's part to Greek drama. he keeps the bloody violence off stage and presents it to us, as we find in Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus, only in reports that come afterward. Now, the report comes not from a messenger, however, but first from one of the girls who is winding a skein of red fabric, okay? The fabric here is red, carrying suggestions of blood passion, bloodshed, and the force of blood lines, certainly. But note that it is also an image, clearly, or meant to recall the image of the Fates in Greek mythology, who spin and cut the thread of human life, okay? Now, the human life of, as we discover it, Leonardo and the groom has already been cut, okay? This is a reference to the sense that it was fated, it was destiny, because that's what the Fates in Greek mythology embody. One of the girls, who is winding the red skein of wool, has seen two male bodies. She did not see the killing itself, but only the aftermath, in which she saw two men lying next to one another, covered with blood. She says, "The lovers dumb, the young man red. On the silent shore, I saw them spread." The report of the killing itself comes from the old beggar woman, the embodiment of death personified. And what she confirms is likely to shock the reader, who expects something else. She says of the two dead bodies, "Their eyes broken flowers, and their teeth 2 fists full of frozen snow. Both of them fell, and the bride comes back, her skirt and her hair stained with their blood. Covered by blankets, both of them come, borne on the shoulders of tall young men." Now, note that the force of life in this image, flowers, is broken in the two dead men, Leonardo and the groom, and is replaced by the image of icy snow, yet another figuration of death. The bride, who has at times wished to die herself in her conflicted guilt and desire, a desire to escape that conflict, is ironically the one who survives and must go on living, though clearly she has mourned these men because her hair is covered with their blood, and clearly she feels guilt for what has happened, this twofold destruction. Now, remember the very different ending that Leonardo had envisioned for him and the bride. They had pledged to fulfill their passion in a secret place and then expire together when they were found. Well, if you think of that, while that certainly would have been sad, that kind of an ending would not necessarily have been entirely tragic. Rather, it might even seem to some like a kind of glorious love-death fulfillment of a desire that couldn't possibly sustain itself in the human world. The real tragedy of blood wedding takes a very different and darker form. The living tragedy of Leonardo and the bride's suffering as block lovers deepens because the play denies them the sexual consummation of that love that they sought, and it denies them the desire or the prophecy that Leonardo makes that they will die together. Neither of those fulfillments occurs. What happens is much worse. Now, the knife fight, of course, is never explicitly described. We have to infer certain things, but certainly Lorca implies and invites us to envision this. Leonardo and the groom, both knife-wielding rivals for the same woman, these two men from enemy clans confront one another in the forest and stab each other to death simultaneously. How else could there be two corpses lying side by side? They are lying side by side in a position together that one would expect the bride and groom to be in on their marriage bed, or that one would expect Leonardo and the bride to be in after the completion of coition. No. All of those things are short-circuited. There's something alarming in this description, though, because Leonardo is joined in death, not with the bride, but rather in a moment of mutual penetration with another man, the groom. This double knife thrust, this simultaneous penetration, is the only one that occurs. There's no sexual penetration. And so, as some critics have noted, it seems like a kind of strange homoerotic substitute for the heterosexual splendor the tree cutters had envisioned, or the love and death embrace that the bride and Leonardo had anticipated, or for the wedding night that the groom had anticipated. None of it. Instead, this strange penetration of man by man. Now, the two young men who are physically united by knives are men then who are joined in the blood from their bodies that flows together. The woodsman had said, of course, that surely Leonardo and the bride's blood would join in sex and then probably join in death. Didn't join in sex, and it is two different blood streams of two men that join now in death. This union. They are also, however, joined, these two, by knives, joined by their love for the same woman, and joined by the bloody history of their feuding families. In short, they could not be more powerfully bound and alike in their very antagonism. And they're above all joined in death. Now, the failure of Leonardo's sexual consummation with the bride then deepens the tragic loss of the life of these two men who loved her. And adding to the tragedy of the living is the fact that the bride must go on living, and as such is destined to live and to die, according to local custom, a virgin widow. In this particular part of southern Spain, young widows, like the groom's mother, do not remarry. They devote their lives to mourning behind thick walls. This is what Andalusian tradition demands, and we've already seen it in the cloistered life of the bridegroom's mother and her frustrated longing. A man who died when the bridegroom was a young boy, 20-odd years later, she's still alone. Leonardo's widow, the wife, is going to have to live the same way. She too is a widow now. After Leonardo's death, the wife's mother tells her, "Over your bed, place a cross of ash where once his pillow was." As a widow, Leonardo's wife knows that her own life is also over effectively. It is essentially reduced to ashes. The cross that her mother refers to here, like the sign of the cross that the bridegroom's mother makes earlier, is an empty symbol. It has no power to redeem or comfort or relieve the life in death to which these young widows, both Leonardo's wife and the bride, are now consigned. In fact, a cross of ashes, as the mother-in-law describes it, a cross of ashes is an apt description of what their lives are going to be. Now, the groom's already isolated mother is now also going to be even more alone, even more grief-stricken, even more enraged in a certain sense than she will be without him, though she may not be entirely alone, as we'll see. She says, the groom's mother says, that she must face, quote, "terrible days with my grief and me, and these four walls," those walls that are the symbol of domestic entrapment, of the condition of women. Now, you'll note, rather than going back, however, to her father's cave, the bride does something unexpected. Yes, it's true he lives in a wasteland. Yes, they live underground. But one would expect that the last place she would want to go would be to the mother-in-law, the mother of the man she abandoned, who hates her and who blames her for her son's death. And yet that is precisely where the bride does go. Why? Well, for two reasons, I think. First, the reason, let me first of all suggest a reason she does not go. She's not going there to suffer in atonement for the blame she faces for her son's death. This is not a purgatorial ritual she's putting herself through. She goes for two other reasons, however. First, I think, she goes not to suffer in atonement, not to suffer some humiliation and laceration for her sin, but rather she goes in the fervent hope that the older woman will actually kill her and thereby free her from her unbearable guilt and grief. This is what happens when she arrives. The bride says, "I'm coming here." The mother says, "Who is it?" The neighbor says, "Don't you know her?" Oh, the mother says, that's why I'm asking who she is, because I mustn't know her, so I shan't sink my teeth into her neck. Serpent! She moves toward the bride threateningly and then stops. She strikes the bride, who falls to the ground. Neighbor, in the name of God, she tries to separate them. And then the bride says to the neighbor, no, leave her. I came here so that she could kill me, so that they could bear me away with them. Oh, she says, see how soft my throat is. Less effort for you than cutting a dahlia in your garden. But no, that's not, oh, I'm pure as a newborn child. But look, you could cut my throat. Okay. Now note that clearly the mother is tempted to kill the bride. And yet she doesn't oblige her. Because after all, from her point of view, from the mother's point of view, death would be too easy for this nemesis, this woman she didn't trust because of her family past, this woman who lives in a wasteland, this woman who took her son from her, this woman who cavorted with a member of the Felix clan. All these reasons she has to hate and distrust her have only been magnified. But she wants her, clearly, to suffer, so she doesn't take her life. Rather, she says, what does your death matter to me? What does anything matter to me? But the bride also comes, not just to be killed, which she doesn't get, but she comes for a second reason. She comes to explain, not to justify herself and her betrayal, but rather to appeal to the older woman's understanding, sensing somehow in this woman that capacity. She says, I want you to know that I am clean. She wants to emphasize that she is, as she says, pure as a newborn child. I have not lost my virginity, if that's what you're concerned about. But then she says, you would have gone off too. I was a woman burning, full of pain inside and out, and your son was a tiny drop of water that I hope would give me children, land, health. But the other one was a dark river full of branches that brought me the sound of its reeds and its soft song. Oh, your son was my ambition, and I haven't deceived him, but the other one's arm dragged me like a wave from the sea, like the butt of a mule, and would always have dragged me, always, even if I'd been an old woman and all the sons of your sons had tried to hold me down by the hair, I would have gone. Ha! The mother says, oh, she's not to blame then. Oh, whose blame is it? Now, note here that this is the moment, one might say, in the bride's explanation. This is the moment that Aristotle would call the recognition. The moment when the bride fully understands most completely how and why her tragedy has occurred. That it was beyond her control, though she tried, she should have seen the end. The bride knows now for certain that despite all her efforts and aspirations, her mistake going off with Leonardo was inevitable. It would have happened even if she had gone back for days or years with her husband. That she was driven by a force beyond her control, as Leonardo had told her in the forest they were. Her desire, she says, for Leonardo was a dark river, a sea wave, a force of nature, and all your son could have offered me was a drop of water, okay? It wasn't what I needed. Now, note that these metaphors that she uses to describe her desire now, that she fully understands its inevitability, are metaphors she had used earlier. But earlier she had still blamed herself, still held herself responsible. Now, while she doesn't try to justify herself, she explains that she knows she had no choice. And she adds on two occasions here that she wants the mother-in-law to know that she was still pure, still a virgin, though that, after all, was not something she had any control over. And if indeed they had not been interrupted, she would not have been a virgin. Certainly she isn't a virgin by intention. And her mother-in-law now knows that. She dismisses this technical virginity by asking sarcastically, what does your honor mean to me? It's a fair remark, because the bride has, after all, brought shame on her dead son. Everyone assumes that when she ran off with Leonardo, they became lovers. If they were not lovers before, they were found. Yet, despite the mother's deep antagonism, despite her skepticism about this explanation, and despite her complete disregard for the bride's mention of her enduring virginity. Nonetheless, almost against her will, the woman seems moved by one thing that the bride says: "You would have gone too." That is, if you felt the desire that consumed me, you would have fled your own wedding. Now remember, we've noted that the mother often speaks longingly of the erotic pleasure she enjoyed with her young husband before he was killed, and the sexual frustration she has felt for 2 decades thereafter. So it seems that the bride's appeal, "you would have gone to," indeed strikes a chord. Enough so that at the end of the play, the mother and the bride seem destined to live together in the older woman's house, not happily. They are united in grief and sorrow, and at the end they join together in a chant of lamentation. Now, in a way that recalls the wife and mother-in-law earlier, the woman speaks of sweet nails, sweet cross, sweet name, Jesus. We remember the nails of moonlight that Leonardo had mentioned, okay? Moonlight is passion, as a kind of nail binding us together. The nails here are the nails in the crucifix, the nails in Christ's hands and feet, and they invoke religion. In the same way, earlier in the act, we saw the wife and mother-in-law invoking the cross of ashes. But again, the crucifix, the nails in Christ's hands, offer no consolation. It's a cleaving to a religious tradition that cannot control sexual desire, cannot regulate passion, and ultimately has very little power to console. The bride says, "Let the cross protect the living and the dead." But that's the end of the discussion of the cross. What the cross is replaced with in this interspersed chant is this: the knife. Mother: "Neighbors with a knife, with a small knife, on a day appointed," that is to say, on a day destined, between 2 and 3 in the morning, the 2 men killed each other for love of the same woman, though that phrase, "killed each other for love," points to the peculiar homoerotic implications of the double stabbing. The bride then adds, "And this is a knife, a small knife, that barely fits the hand," to which the mother adds, "that barely fits the hand," echoing now her daughter-in-law, "but that slides in clean through the startled flesh and stops there at the place where trembles enmeshed the dark root of a scream." And neighbors kneeling and weeping join them in this lamentation. Now, although the bride invokes the cross to protect the living and the dead, as we've seen, religion is ineffectual either in regulating sexual desire or preventing bloodshed, okay? In the end, the groom repeats his father's destiny in a blood feud. He's destroyed. The bride repeats her mother's destiny by violating her marriage vows. And Leonardo's wife repeats her mother's destiny as a betrayed woman. And in all likelihood, Leonardo repeats his father's destiny, it seems, as a man who cannot stay married and betrays his wife. All of them, it seems, now are simply enacting what has been prescribed. In the face of these catastrophes, Christianity is then just a stockpile of inherited symbols and rituals. And it's notable then for its ineffectuality in the play, not that it isn't a constraining force and a binding force, one that, for example, seems to reinforce the cultural need for widows never to remarry, but it is not one that can in any way alter the impulses to eroticism or violence. Note that the cross then is replaced in this chant by the knife, the same image that we saw in the very first scene of the play when the mother and the bridegroom were discussing it. By returning to this symbol, structurally, Lorca reminds us that the catastrophe that we have witnessed with a knife was inevitable from the knife's first appearance, when we saw it in the hand of the bridegroom as he left the vineyard. There's an old saying that when in a film you see a gun, you know at some point the gun is going to go off. Okay, when the mother mentions the knife and what it can do to the human body, you know that's going to happen. The same knife that the bridegroom had used to cut grapes and to nurture and nourish himself, also now cuts off another man's life, and with another knife, his own life is cut short at the very same moment. The dark root of a scream that emerges from this double death and the response to it, that dark root of a scream, I think, refers to the stifled cry of the two women who are doomed to spend their lives together in a strange, strained solidarity away from the world, frustrated in a state of silent screaming and unhappiness. Whereas Strindberg's The Father ends misogynistically with the triumph of an evil woman taking possession of a daughter, Bloodwedding ends with what seems to me Lorca's unmistakable compassion for the plight of both these women, and really all the women in the play. Along with Euripides, I think Lorca is more attuned to the position of restriction and suffering of women within patriarchy than any other tragedian that we're reading. Even more, I think, than Euripides. Okay, so that's all I have to say about Bloodwedding. But while we still have 10 minutes, I want to turn now to an introduction to Arthur Miller and say a few things about Miller's theory of tragedy, so that when in my next broadcast I discuss Death of a Salesman, you'll have a context. Okay, now it's important to note that Miller wrote one of the most influential theories of tragedy in the 20th century, and he wrote it the same year, 1949. He published it the same year that he wrote and produced his greatest play, The Death of a Salesman. You'll note that I have sent an email attachment with the excerpts from Miller's essay, Tragedy in the Common Man. And I'm going to introduce Miller now and talk about that briefly. Having started in ancient Greece and then passed through Britain, France, Germany, Sweden, and Spain, we conclude our study of tragedy with an American. With Arthur Miller. Along with Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams and Edward Albee, Miller is one of the dominant American dramatists of the 20th century. Born into a Jewish family in New York City, he began writing plays in the mid-40s and made his first mark with a family drama titled All My Sons in 1947. The dynamics of middle-class American family life would become one of Miller's hallmarks throughout his career, most notably in Death of a Salesman, which premiered on Broadway in 1949 and was immediately hailed as a masterpiece. Since then, it has been remounted countless times and has been the subject of several film adaptations, and we're going to be seeing clips from both of them, okay? Now, at the height of Miller's career, two remarkable things occurred. In 1936, he divorced his wife of 15 years and married the actress Marilyn Monroe in what was regarded as one of the most improbable celebrity unions ever, a cerebral playwright and the country's most famous sex symbol, who had just before been married briefly to the baseball legend Joe DiMaggio. Yet, Monroe converted to Judaism to marry Miller, and his children loved her. Not long after their marriage, Miller was called to testify before the notorious House Committee on Un-American Activities, led by Joseph McCarthy and by Donald Trump's old associate, Roy Cohn. Unlike some others who were summoned to testify, Miller steadfastly refused to name names. 3 years earlier, he saw what was going on and wrote a play based on these hysterical interrogations that came out at the height of the Cold War. That play, which I suspect many of you know, is The Crucible, set during the trials, the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century, but really transparently about the witch trials that were taking place in the United States in the early and mid-1950s. Not surprisingly, Miller's marriage to Marilyn Monroe began to unravel, and they divorced after 5 years. And Miller wrote a chronicle of their vexed relationship and his feeling of torment at Monroe's self-destructive personality and growing emotional dependency. That play took the form of an experimental psychodrama in 1964 titled After the Fall. Miller lived to be 90, and in the decades that followed, he continued to write plays that, to one degree or another, reflect his conception of the tragedy of common men and women. These plays include a World War II drama, Incident at Vichy, set during the interrogations in Nazi-occupied France, and a fascinating play called View from the Bridge, set on the docks of Red Hook, Brooklyn, and also in 1968, probably his last great play was The Price. After Miller's work, after the late 60s, his work never reached the heights of the plays of the 40s and 50s or mid-60s. But 4 or 5 of his best plays, the ones that I've mentioned, really have taken their place in the canon of enduring American drama. Now, if you have this particular document, you might want to consult it here, or if not, after the lecture, go back and look at it, because these are excerpts from the essay that Miller published in 1949, shortly after the opening of Death of a Salesman, and clearly a theory of tragedy that seems to be the basis upon which Death of a Salesman was built. He begins, without ever mentioning Aristotle's name, by opposing some fundamental concepts originating in Aristotle's Poetics that had been, to one degree or another, honored, even by Shakespeare, ever since. The first that he opposes is Aristotle's idea that a tragic hero must be a person of great social stature. He says, we have often been told that, but in this age, few tragedies are written. And it's often because, of course, there seem to be so few people who you could write about of tragic stature the way Sophocles or Shakespeare or Racine did. For one reason or another, he says, we are often held to be below tragedy, ordinary contemporary people, or tragedy above us. The inevitable conclusion is, of course, that the tragic mode is now archaic, fit only for very high-placed kings or the kingly. But insistence upon the rank of the tragic hero, or the so-called nobility of his character, is really but a clinging to the outward forms of tragedy. In short, Miller rejects the idea that a tragic figure needs to be a person of high rank social significance. Thus, because we live in a democratic society, it does not mean that we shouldn't write tragedies just because we don't have such individuals. That isn't essential to tragedy. Okay. Note, Miller suggests, the common man, the ordinary individual, well, let us say the common man, not necessarily ordinary, can be the subject of a tragedy. I believe that the common man is as apt a subject for tragedy in its highest sense as kings were. If the exaltation of tragic action were truly the property of the high-bred character alone, it is inconceivable that the mass of mankind should cherish tragedy above all other forms, let alone be capable of understanding it. I think that the tragic feeling is evoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his personal dignity, secure his rightful place in the world. 2 crucial ideas here. Number one, the common individual can be tragic, and the proof he cites for that is that even in ancient times, ordinary men and audience goers would not have been noble themselves, would not have been kings themselves, and yet the fact that they could identify with and relate to a Medea or a Sophocles or an Electra or a Pentheus or an Agamemnon means that that capacity for identification suggests that tragic feelings aren't restricted by social class. In short, the very fact that they could cherish tragedy meant that middle-class individuals can also be the subject of tragedy. But what is it that makes an individual then, independent of social status, tragic? As he puts it here, the willingness to lay down one's life to secure personal dignity, to secure one's rightful place in the world. This is essentially a definition of Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman. The notion that an individual who seeks personal dignity and the rightful place in the world against all odds is by fundamental willingness and the desire to combat the forces that would rob him of his dignity or place in the world. He is fundamentally, or she is fundamentally, tragic, though more often it is a he in Arthur Miller's place. Now, if one thinks of that definition, it does fit some of the other tragic figures we've seen. Certainly Othello, and I think one might say Wojciech, and certainly Electra and Medea, all seek through acts of resistance to assert personal dignity, to secure that, and their rightful place in the world. I'm not sure that it is entirely true, say, of Phaedra or the characters in Blood Wedding, but it is something that certainly applies not just to Miller's own tragedies, but to others as well, and above all, as we'll see, to Willy Loman. Now, one of the things that I think one can extrapolate from this is that although he says tragedy is something that can, indeed should be, built around the common man, he doesn't mean by the common man the ordinary man. Willy Loman is a common man, a middle-class man, a salesman, but he's not ordinary. What distinguishes him, which makes him in some way extraordinary, and therefore worthy of tragedy as a common man, is that unlike other men, he seeks a great effort and risk to himself, even self-destructively, an assertion of his own personal dignity and a need to secure his rightful place in the world. Now, Miller then goes on to, again, without ever mentioning Aristotle, attack a concept that has grown up around Aristotle, the tragic flaw. Now, note that Aristotle's hamartia, as I've said many times, means a mistake. It may or may not be related to a particular weakness in the tragic character. But Miller adopts the popular conception of hamartia as a tragic flaw and says, no, a tragic flaw is not necessary, nor is there necessarily any weakness in a tragic individual. The crack or flaw is really nothing and need be nothing, but his inherent unwillingness to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity, the image of his rightful status, that is not really a weakness. It may lead to mistakes, yes, but what Miller wants to emphasize is that what might be construed as a weakness is co-functional very often with the tragic hero's innermost strength. Now, what we're going to find in Willy Loman is that there is clearly an error on his part, a consistent error. He repeats and repeats and repeats. He deludes himself. He mistakes popularity for success. And yet, while that is clearly a weakness in him, Miller would have us understand that it is also inseparable from a fundamental tenacity in his character and a resistance to the idea of being ignored, an insistence on somehow asserting his personal dignity. Now, the last things that you might note in this sort of reinterpretation or rebuttal of Aristotelian theory about tragedy that Miller has obviously got to take on is the effect on the audience, pity and fear. Fear is no problem for him. He says from the total onslaught by an individual against the scheme of things that degrades him in the seemingly stable cosmos surrounding us comes the terror, comes the fear that classically is associated with tragedy. And indeed, he said the protagonist's thrust for freedom is the quality in which tragedy exalts, and the failure of that thrust for freedom produces fear, but also the underlying fear of being displaced you see in, say, Willy Loman, is something that the audience can identify with. The disaster being inherent is being torn away from one's chosen image, one's own dignity, one's place in the world. When an audience sees that fear and suffering and struggling on an individual who feels such a sense of degradation and disrespect in the face of the world and struggles against it, we fear that that could happen to us. Okay, that's consistent then with the Aristotelian concept of fear as one of the two tragic emotions. But what about pity? Well, here's where Miller departs from Aristotle in the most radical way. He doesn't believe in pity as a tragic emotion. Rather, he says, tragedy implies optimism in its author. The possibility of victory must be there in tragedy. Where pathos rules, a character has fought a battle he could not possibly have won because it's incapable of grappling with a superior force. Pathos is truly the mode of the pessimist, not the tragedian. But tragedy requires a balance between what is possible and what is impossible. All right. We begin here in this passage with a suggestion that, quite against every practice we've seen in tragedy thus far, that there must be in tragedy not a sense of inevitability, not a grappling with the superior force that will always destroy you, which we've seen in all 7 of the plays heretofore, but rather there must be the possibility of victory, a balance between what is possible and what is impossible. Yes, a balance between what is difficult, what is oppressive, but which one might possibly be able to overcome through a sufficient effort of will. That's not what happens in the tragedy of Willy Loman, but Miller would have us understand that Willy is not foredestined to death and failure, even though the title might imply it, that there is within him the capacity, at least, for a resistance that could triumph, that he's not socially programmed or doomed by the gods or by some ineluctable force within himself. And because of that, Miller suggests, there can be no pity, because you can only pity an individual who has absolutely no possibility of victory in a play, in a tragedy of his creation, where there is such a possibility. You fear that what happens to the tragic figure may happen to you. You feel a deep sympathy for them and a respect and a fear, but you don't feel pity. Pity is a kind of condescending emotion that comes only when we feel there was no hope to begin with at all. All right, that does it for today. I'll be in touch again about the next lecture. I hope you all get this one. Let me know if you don't, and please let me know if you have any thoughts or questions.